At 2:10 p.m. on May 11, 1996, a commercial jetliner filled with families, tourists, and airline crew disappeared from radar and slammed into the Florida Everglades at more than 500 miles per hour. There was no distress call, no warning to passengers, no chance to escape. In just a few violent minutes, ValuJet Flight 592 became one of the deadliest airline disasters in American history. Not because of weather, not because of terrorism, but because a fire started in the one place passengers could never see, the cargo hold beneath their feet. ValuJet Flight 592 departed Miami International Airport bound for Atlanta with 105 passengers and 5 crew members on board. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas DC-932, a workhorse jet that had been flying safely for decades. On the surface, there was nothing unusual about the flight. The weather was clear. The plane was properly fueled. The pilots were experienced. What no one on board knew was that the aircraft was carrying a deadly cargo that should never have been placed on a passenger flight at all. ValuJet was a rapidly growing low-cost airline in the mid-1990s. Founded in 1992, the company built its business model on aggressive cost-cutting. Cheap tickets, fast expansion, and minimal overhead allowed ValuJet to undercut major carriers. In just 4 years, it went from a startup to one of the fastest-growing airlines in the United States. But behind the low fares was a system strained by shortcuts, outsourcing, and a safety culture that regulators would later describe as dangerously inadequate. The DC-9 assigned to Flight 592 had arrived in Miami earlier that day. Before its departure to Atlanta, maintenance workers loaded several items into the forward cargo hold. Among them were 5 cardboard boxes labeled as oxygen canisters, empty. These boxes contained chemical oxygen generators, devices designed to produce breathable oxygen through a violent chemical reaction. They are used in aircraft emergency oxygen systems and generate intense heat when activated. Each generator can burn at temperatures exceeding 500 degrees Fahrenheit. These generators were not empty. They were expired. And most critically, their safety caps, which prevent accidental activation, had not been installed. The oxygen generators came from an aircraft maintenance contractor called SaberTech. SaberTech had been hired to perform maintenance work on ValuJet aircraft in Miami. As part of routine maintenance, SaberTech removed expired oxygen generators from another aircraft. Instead of properly deactivating them and shipping them according to hazardous materials regulations, the generators were placed loose in cardboard boxes. No protective caps were installed, no hazardous materials warning labels were applied, and no one informed ValuJet flight operations that the cargo posed an extreme fire risk. Federal regulations prohibited chemical oxygen generators from being transported on passenger aircraft unless they were properly packaged and declared. These rules existed because oxygen generators are not passive devices. If triggered by impact, vibration, or heat, they produce oxygen and fire simultaneously. In an enclosed cargo hold, they can ignite surrounding materials and create an uncontrollable blaze. At 2:04 p.m., ValuJet Flight 592 took off from Miami. Just minutes later, as the aircraft climbed through 10,000 feet, something in the forward cargo hold activated at least one of the oxygen generators. Investigators later concluded that vibration during takeoff likely caused the firing pin on one or more generators to strike, igniting the chemical reaction. The fire began out of sight, below the passenger cabin, in a compartment that had no fire suppression system. At the time, many older aircraft, like the DC-9, did not require smoke detectors or fire extinguishing systems in certain cargo holds. The design assumed that fires would be rare and manageable. That assumption would prove fatal. As the generators burned, they released a steady flow of oxygen, intensifying the flames. Nearby materials ignited quickly. Tires, wiring insulation, and other flammable components fueled the fire. Thick smoke began to fill the aircraft. At approximately 2:10 p.m., the cockpit voice recorder captured the first signs of trouble. The pilots detected an electrical problem and a smell of smoke. Seconds later, alarms began sounding. The cockpit filled with smoke so dense the pilots struggled to see their instruments. Captain Candy Kubek and First Officer Richard Hazen immediately declared an emergency. Their voices remained calm, professional, and controlled. They requested an immediate return to Miami. Air traffic controllers cleared them for an emergency landing, but the fire was growing faster than anyone realized. As smoke poured into the cockpit, critical flight control cables routed beneath the cabin floor began to weaken. The DC-9 relied on mechanical cables to control the elevators and rudder. When exposed to intense heat, these cables can stretch, snap, or seize. Within minutes, the pilots were fighting an aircraft that was becoming increasingly unresponsive. Passengers never heard an announcement. There was no time. Radar data showed the aircraft beginning to descend rapidly. Witnesses on the ground later reported seeing the plane trailing smoke before it plunged nose down into the Everglades. The impact destroyed the aircraft instantly. All 110 people on board were killed. There were no survivors. Recovery crews faced horrific conditions. The crash site was a remote, swampy area filled with alligators, snakes, and deep mud. Wreckage was scattered across miles of wetlands. Identification of victims took months. Families waited in agony for confirmation of their loved one's fate. Within days, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board began piecing together what had happened. Almost immediately, attention turned to the cargo hold. Burn patterns on recovered wreckage indicated a fire had originated beneath the passenger cabin. Chemical residue tests later confirmed the presence of oxygen generator compounds. The discovery raised a chilling question: why were hazardous oxygen generators on a passenger flight at all? As investigators dug deeper, a disturbing chain of negligence emerged, one that extended far beyond a single mistake on the tarmac, and it would soon expose systemic failures inside ValuJet, its contractors, and the federal agency responsible for overseeing them. As the wreckage of ValuJet Flight 592 was pulled piece by piece from the Everglades, investigators uncovered evidence that pointed not to a freak accident, but to a cascading breakdown of responsibility across multiple organizations. What initially appeared to be a tragic fire quickly revealed itself as a textbook case of corporate negligence enabled by regulatory failure. The oxygen generators that ignited the fire were traced back to SaberTech, the maintenance contractor operating out of Miami. SaberTech technicians had removed the expired generators from a ValuJet aircraft days earlier. Federal rules require that chemical oxygen generators be rendered inert before transport, typically by installing safety caps that prevent accidental activation. SaberTech had the caps available, they simply did not use them. Internal company records showed that SaberTech employees were not properly trained in hazardous materials handling. Some workers later testified they were unaware that oxygen generators were classified as dangerous goods. Others stated they had never received formal instruction on federal shipping regulations. Despite this lack of training, SaberTech was routinely responsible for handling and shipping hazardous aircraft components. The boxes containing the generators were mislabeled. They were marked as empty oxygen canisters, a description that was false and dangerously misleading. Because of this, the cargo was never flagged as hazardous, never inspected as such, and never rejected for transport on a passenger aircraft. But SaberTech was only one link in the chain. ValuJet itself failed to verify what was being loaded onto its aircraft. The airline relied heavily on contractors and operated with minimal internal oversight. Investigators later found that ValuJet's maintenance and safety departments were understaffed and overwhelmed by the airline's rapid expansion. Aircraft were flying more hours, more routes were being added, and safety systems were stretched thin. In the months before the crash, ValuJet had already been cited multiple times by the Federal Aviation Administration for maintenance violations. Complaints from pilots and mechanics raised concerns about spare parts, record keeping, and operational pressure to keep planes flying. These warnings did not result in meaningful corrective action. The FAA, tasked with regulating airline safety, had adopted a philosophy of delegated oversight during the 1990s. Rather than directly inspecting every airline operation, the agency increasingly relied on airlines and contractors to police themselves. This approach was intended to improve efficiency. In practice, it created blind spots large enough for deadly risks to pass unnoticed. In ValuJet's case, FAA inspectors were responsible for monitoring one of the fastest-growing airlines in the country with limited personnel. One inspector was assigned to oversee dozens of aircraft and hundreds of maintenance activities. Documentation reviews often replaced physical inspections. Problems were identified on paper, but enforcement lagged behind expansion. After the crash, FAA officials acknowledged that they had been aware of safety concerns at ValuJet. They had debated grounding the airline months earlier, but chose instead instead to continue monitoring while allowing operations to proceed. Flight 592 would never complete its journey. The NTSB investigation concluded that the probable cause of the crash was a fire in the cargo compartment caused by the activation of improperly packaged chemical oxygen generators. But the report went further. It cited Sabertech's failure to properly handle hazardous materials, ValuJet's inadequate oversight of its contractors, and the FAA's failure to require fire detection and suppression systems in the cargo holds of older aircraft. The cockpit voice recorder revealed the final moments of the flight in haunting detail. Captain Kubek and First Officer Hazen worked methodically through emergency procedures as smoke overwhelmed the cockpit. At one point, they struggled to breathe. Their final transmission showed no panic, only urgency. They never lost control due to error. The aircraft failed around them. Public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Within days of the NTSB's preliminary findings, the FAA grounded ValuJet's entire fleet. Hundreds of flights were canceled. Thousands of passengers were stranded. The airline's stock collapsed. Lawsuits from victims' families poured in, alleging gross negligence and wrongful death. Sabertech became the focus of criminal investigations. Federal prosecutors charged the company and several of its employees with mishandling hazardous materials and making false statements. While some charges were later dropped or reduced, the case sent a clear message that safety shortcuts in aviation could carry criminal consequences. Congress held hearings to examine how such a disaster could occur in modern American aviation. Families of the victims testified, describing how cost-cutting decisions and ignored warnings had stolen their loved ones' lives. Lawmakers questioned FAA officials about oversight failures and the risks of deregulation, and the answers were uncomfortable. ValuJet never fully recovered, though it was later allowed to resume limited operations and eventually rebranded after merging with AirTran Airways. The name ValuJet became permanently associated with tragedy. The crash ended the airline's identity and reshaped public trust in low-cost carriers. But the most significant impact of Flight 592 would come not from courtroom verdicts or corporate collapse, but from changes forced upon the entire aviation industry. The disaster had exposed a hidden danger beneath the cabin floor, one that regulators could no longer ignore. In the aftermath of ValuJet Flight 592, the aviation industry faced a reckoning it could no longer delay. The crash did not introduce a new danger. It exposed one that had existed quietly for decades, hidden beneath the cabin floor, overlooked by regulators and underestimated by airlines. Within months of the disaster, the FAA began implementing sweeping changes. One of the most critical involved cargo compartment safety. Investigators had made it clear that the fire on Flight 592 became uncontrollable because the aircraft's cargo hold had no smoke detection system and no fire suppression capability. At the time, federal rules allowed certain classes of cargo compartments on older aircraft to operate without either. That exemption ended. The FAA mandated smoke detectors in all cargo compartments on passenger aircraft. It also required built-in fire suppression systems capable of flooding the compartment with fire extinguishing agents. These changes were not optional and not gradual. Airlines were given firm deadlines to retrofit older aircraft or remove them from service. Hazardous materials regulations were rewritten and reinforced. Chemical oxygen generators were banned entirely from transport on passenger aircraft unless they were installed and operational as part of the plane's emergency system. Loose generators, expired or not, were prohibited cargo. The rules became clearer, stricter, and more aggressively enforced. Training requirements changed as well. Maintenance contractors were no longer allowed to treat hazardous materials handling as an afterthought. Formal certification, documented training, and accountability became mandatory. Airlines could no longer distance themselves from contractor mistakes. If a contractor failed, the airline would answer for it. The FAA also re-examined its oversight model. While delegation remained part of the system, ValuJet forced regulators to admit that unchecked growth combined with minimal supervision was a recipe for disaster. Inspector staffing was increased. Surveillance of rapidly expanding airlines became more aggressive. Warning signs that once lingered in paperwork now demanded immediate action. For families of the victims, none of these changes could bring back what was lost. Lawsuits continued for years. Settlements were reached, but many families said the most painful part was learning how preventable the crash had been. There was no mechanical defect that doomed Flight 592, no unforeseeable chain reaction, just ordinary decisions made carelessly by people who assumed nothing would go wrong. The story of ValuJet Flight 592 is not just about a fire in a cargo hold. It is about what happens when speed matters more than safety, when oversight becomes paperwork, and when warnings are treated as inconveniences instead of alarms. Every regulation rewritten after May 11th, 1996 carries the weight of 110 lives lost because the system failed them. Today, passengers rarely think about what lies beneath their seats. That silence is not an accident. It exists because disasters like ValuJet Flight 592 forced change through tragedy. The Everglades crash became a turning point, a moment when aviation safety advanced not through innovation, but through accountability paid for at the highest possible cost. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed learning something new today, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment telling us what you thought of this story.